In 1850, the average American didn't have a bank account. In 1900, most still didn't. The system you live inside right now, the mortgage, the credit score, the monthly payment, the debt that follows you from your 20s to your 60s, is younger than some of the buildings still standing in your city. That's not a metaphor. That's a fact they don't put in textbooks. And once you sit with it, something shifts. Because if the system is that new, something else was there before it. Something that worked, something that got replaced, and someone made sure you'd never ask what it was. Let me start with a chair, not a museum piece. A chair my grandmother left me, made sometime in the 1840s. Heavy oak, nearly 2 centuries old, still sits perfectly level. No wobble, no creak, no repairs I can find anywhere. I started trying to trace who made it. I never found a name. What I found instead was a system and the story of how it was buried. The man who built that chair almost certainly never walked into a bank. Not because he was poor, not because he lived in the middle of nowhere, because the world he lived in was organized on completely different principles. Not an earlier version of our system, something structurally different, built on different assumptions, assumptions that were, in one very specific decade, methodically dismantled. Here's where it starts to get strange. 1817. Thomas Jefferson, former president, author of the Declaration of Independence, one of the most connected men in American history, requests a copy of a book. Not a classified document, not a rare manuscript, a pricing guide used by carpenters in Philadelphia. He is refused. The Carpenters Company of Philadelphia, founded in 1724, tells the former President of the United States that their rule book is for members only. Think about what that means. Jefferson, who designed his own home, who understood architecture better than most professionals of his era, denied access to a book about how tradesmen priced their work. Why? What was in it? What was worth protecting that carefully from a man like him? That question has never gotten a clean answer, and I don't think that's an accident. The Carpenters Company still operates today, 300 years. Their members in the 18th century weren't carpenters the way we use that word. They were master builders, architect, engineer, and contractor in one. They built Independence Hall. They built Carpenters Hall, where the First Continental Congress met. These buildings are still standing, still structurally sound, built under a system that was later erased. Their rule book, the one Jefferson couldn't see, described something called unit pricing. Every stage of construction had a standardized fair price, set not by negotiation between a buyer and a seller, but by experienced guild members called measurers, always working in pairs. 2 people had to agree on every number. No individual could inflate costs. The system was designed deliberately to be fair to both sides, the craftsman and the client equally. That book wasn't secret because it was commercially sensitive. It was secret because it contained proof that an economy could be built around fairness instead of extraction, that communities could govern themselves, that you didn't need a financial institution standing between every transaction, taking its percentage. Someone decided that idea was too dangerous to share, even with a president. The old system didn't need banks because it had something banks replaced: networks of mutual obligation, guilds that set fair prices, extended credit between neighbors, not institutional credit, but community credit. A craftsman might take payment in flour, in timber, in a season of labor. The Bureau of Labor Statistics documented this in 1928. Throughout the first century of American settlement, Currency was scarce and little used in the payment of wages. People built things together and settled debts in kind. Your neighbor knew your name. Your creditor knew your children. That's not primitive. That's a different kind of architecture, one designed for people, not for profit. Now, here's the argument against everything I just said, and I want you to hear it, because it's real. By the mid-1800s, the old system was chaotic. Over 10,000 unique legal banknotes circulated before 1863, and that's not counting counterfeits. A $5 bill from New York might be worth $4 in New Jersey. Merchants subscribed to weekly fraud bulletins just to know which currency to refuse. The official story is that the National Currency Act of 1863 fixed all of this, brought order, created stability, dragged America into the modern age, and they're right about the chaos. I'm not disputing that, but I want you to notice something. The buildings built under the old system still stand. The furniture still holds together after 180 years. We haven't built anything like it since. So when exactly did chaos become the only alternative to what we have now? And who decided that? February 25th, 1863. Lincoln signs the National Currency Act. Senate vote, 23 to 21. 2 votes. 2. The entire architecture of American debt, the mortgage, the student loan, the credit card, the payday lender, traces back to a margin of 2 votes. The stated purpose of the act, confirmed by the Federal Reserve's own archives, was not stability. It was to finance the Civil War by manufacturing demand for federal bonds. National banks were required to purchase Treasury securities equal to 1/3 of their capital. In return, they received banknotes. To issue more money, they had to buy more government debt. The whole system was designed from its first day to make banks permanently dependent on, and therefore permanently invested in, federal borrowing. Stability was the story they sold. The mechanism was a closed loop of institutional dependency, and then they eliminated the alternatives. In 1864, a 2% tax on state banknotes. In 1865, 10%. At 10%, running a local currency became impossible. Within years, thousands of community monetary systems, regional, flexible, human-scaled, were taxed into extinction, legally, quietly. And if you weren't paying very close attention, it looked like evolution. 9 months before the Currency Act, Lincoln had signed the Homestead Act, 160 acres of free land to any American willing to settle and farm it. The promise of the country made literal, except historians calculate that actually developing a claim cost between $1,000 and $2,500 when you factored in tools, seed, livestock, and supplies. The National Archives admits it plainly. Most laborers and farmers simply couldn't afford to do it. Only 40% of claims were ever successfully completed. The rest failed, and the majority of land ended up with speculators, railroads, and large operations. Let me say that again more simply. The government gave people land they couldn't use without borrowing money. 9 months later, they created the system those people had to borrow from. Free land, mandatory debt. The loop closed perfectly. What filled the space left by the guilds has a name that history books mention briefly and move past quickly: the company town. By the 1880s, roughly 2,000 of them existed across America. Workers paid not in currency, but in scrip, redeemable only at company stores. Housing owned by the company. Food from the company store. Prices set by the company with no competition. Workers accumulated debts they were legally required to pay before they could leave. 75% of all American scrip came from coal companies in Appalachia. Workers couldn't leave because they owed more than they earned. The federal commission that investigated the Pullman strike of 1894 called Pullman's system un-American. But by then, the old systems were gone. The guilds dismantled, the local currencies taxed into extinction, community credit replaced by institutional debt. All that remained was the company store, and everyone owed it. You can argue about whether this was designed or emergent. What you can't argue is the outcome. Now, I want to show you proof that the old system worked. Not historical proof, living proof, the Amish. They still use a contribution-based economy. When a member can't cover a medical bill, they stand up at their weekly gathering and say so. The community contributes until it's covered. No insurance company profits. No bank collects interest. No algorithm scores your creditworthiness. It functions. It has functioned without modification for over 150 years. Studies consistently show Amish communities exceed national averages on home ownership, food security, and long-term stability. They are living proof that what we were told was impossible is not. But here's the part that should make you pause. The Amish had to fight the United States government to keep this. For years, the federal government insisted they participate in Social Security, which the Amish considered commercial insurance prohibited by their faith. Congress finally granted an exemption in 1965. To maintain an economic system that had worked without incident for over a century, they had to petition the legislature of the most powerful country on earth for special permission. They file a form every year just to live the way their grandparents lived. The fact that permission was required tells you everything. The old system wasn't made obsolete. It was made illegal. And the Amish are the only ones who fought hard enough to keep a piece of it. One last thing, and this one keeps me up at night. Genealogists call it the 1870 brick wall. Before the 1870 census, most American family lines become nearly impossible to trace. That census was the first to name every American. Before it, darkness. After it, a paper trail. The 1890 census, the one that would have shown us who Americans were during the exact decade their economy was transformed, was largely destroyed. A fire in 1896, a larger fire in 1921. The damaged record sat neglected for 12 years. In 1933, Congress authorized their destruction. One day before that authorization was signed, President Hoover laid the cornerstone for the National Archives, a fireproof building specifically designed to protect government records forever. One day, the records that would have shown us the transformation are gone. The institution built to prevent such losses was announced the day after the order to destroy them was given. I don't know what to do with that timing. I just know I can't explain it away. I keep coming back to the chair, almost 200 years old, still level, made by someone who probably never signed a loan document, someone whose name I couldn't find because the records that would have held it were taxed, burned, or authorized for destruction in the right decade, in the right order, in a way that is very hard to call coincidence. We build furniture that falls apart in 5 years. We carry debt for 30. We work for institutions that have never met us and never will. And we call this progress. We've been calling it that for 160 years. But the chair still stands. And somewhere in a building in Philadelphia, there is a book that Thomas Jefferson was not allowed to read. It's still there. The Carpenter's Company still exists. The book still exists. I've looked into whether anyone can access it today. The answer is more complicated than you'd expect. And I think if you could read it, really read it, you would understand not just where this country went, but why it was so important that you never thought to ask.